So I want to talk a little bit about the challenges of procuring financing for hydrogen projects in this region. As we've already discussed, the economic viability on a standalone basis for hydrogen projects is quite uncertain, and the regulatory framework and governmental subsidies at this stage will be critical to give the necessary support to make these projects viable. The policy support does exist, however, at a high level. GCC governments have set out very ambitious targets for hydrogen, the hydrogen sector, and also directed the sovereign wealth funds, national oil companies, and local banking sector to support this sector, the hydrogen sector. So, given the economic uncertainty, the market uncertainty, the scale of the projects that's going to be required, the technological risk that's involved with these sorts of projects, is highly likely that strategic investors in this region, primarily sovereign wealth funds and national oil companies, along with export credit agencies and multilateral development banks, are likely to be in the lead in terms of financing these projects. As mentioned already, there is considerable technological risk associated with these projects, particularly at the scale required to make the projects economically viable. But having said that, there is strong political will to decarbonize the world economy, and hydrogen is a critical part of that. And that is all leading towards the push towards hydrogen. Can you move to the next slide, please? So we've covered a lot of the points in this slide already, but just to reiterate, this region's unique opportunity is that the low cost of renewable energy power, the very high solar capacity factor, and the very high ability to scale up, which is almost unique, the production of renewable energy. The existing mature oil fields in the GCC offer opportunities for carbon capture and storage, and enhancing the project economics through enhanced oil recovery. The geographic situation in between Europe and Asia, the two main markets for hydrogen, and seasonal demand patterns between the GCC and Northern Europe and Asia are very helpful to projects in this region. You just move to the next slide, please. So what are the challenges? Limited water resources, and so that leads to additional desalination costs for electrolysis for green hydrogen. The lack of clear policy and regulatory support in this region. We have national strategies, which are very, very long term, looking out to 2030, 2050, but nothing concrete in terms of actual legislation in place at the moment. The size of the domestic market in the GCC, while it does exist, the population of the GCC is relatively small. So that means that to be economically viable, hydrogen projects in this region have to have a main focus on exporting primarily to Europe and Asia. There is a sizable degree of project-on-project risk. Hydrogen projects involve, particularly green hydrogen projects, involve the production of renewable energy, then electrolysis, liquefaction, shipping, then reconversion to back to hydrogen. So there is a lot of similarities there with the LNG industry, which has a similar chain of value along the sector. And all of this is highly capex intensive. So there are huge amounts of funding required for this. So all of these present some significant challenges to large-scale hydrogen projects. If we could move to the next slide. The technological risk is also a major challenge to overcome in terms of financing. As noted already, there are no really large-scale hydrogen projects currently in existence. Everything is currently at a much smaller pilot study scale. And so lenders will push for completion guarantees from somebody to ensure that they are not left being exposed to this technological risk and the integration of the multiple links in the overall hydrogen value chain. The sponsors will find that unattractive, as given the size of this project, the financial liabilities are huge, and they will be looking to push the risks down to contractors and technology licensors to the extent possible. But given the scale of the projects themselves, it will be very hard for any one entity to provide a complete turnkey wrap of the entire project. And also, if you look at most of the contractors and licensors that are operating in a new market such as hydrogen, they're not likely to have the balance sheet strength to actually satisfy the lenders, even if they did provide a full turnkey wrap. So some form of additional credit enhancement is likely to be required, either through some form of insurance or some more type of additional sponsor support. In addition, the lack of an operational track record of large-scale projects in the hydrogen sector is likely to push the financiers towards looking for reserve accounts and trapping cash in the project to a much greater extent than in a more conventional, mature top technology project. We move to the next slide, please. There is a threshold choice that has to be made at the outset, which is whether to finance the project as one fully integrated project with every stage of the value chain included, or splitting each part of the chain and financing it separately. So, for example, you could have a standalone renewable power project and finance separately the shipping arrangements under long-term charter party arrangements, have the electrolysis process as a tolling arrangement, and approach the project that way. That splitting up the approach has some advantages. It does allow developers with a particular expertise in a particular sector to specialize only and participate only in that sector. They may not be interested in the whole value chain, but they may be interested in building a large renewable plant. And that may be more attractive to certain banks who are comfortable with the technology behind renewable energy, and particularly if there is alternative sources of demand, for example, selling electricity into the grid for that electricity project, that may be a lower risk and viewed as a more attractive for external financing. But splitting up the project in that way does create some issues itself. There is obviously the coordination issue of having a large number of parties with different, possibly conflicting interests with each other involved in a project. That necessarily increases negotiation and the complexity. There could be impacts from one part of the delays on one part of the project or problems with one part of the project on the other. Different sets of lenders could give rise to different intercreditor issues, how you regulate enforcement, and if there are, for example, the electricity will be critical for the other stages of the project downstream, and so anybody lending to the downstream parts of the project will want to ensure that electricity is always going to be available for them. So another structure we have seen in where these issues have arisen is to have different project companies for each phase of the project, but having only one set of lenders with one project company on lending the project debt to the different parts of the value chain. So that allows you to split up the equity part of the project, but keep the debt side of the project whole. And the simplest approach from a documentation perspective, at least, is to have just one integrated project, because that does remove a lot of conflicts of interest and does reduce the number of parties involved. If we could move to the next slide. Insurance is going to be an important part of the risk mitigation story for this project. The issue here will be that insurance underwriters will typically require a large amount of historical data in order to provide insurance and to price that insurance properly. And there is, of course, limited data and limited track record for hydrogen projects. So that is going to make it difficult to procure insurance at a reasonable price. And of course, hydrogen has a particular risk in that it is quite explosive. So careful engagement with insurers and the technical advisors in particular will be necessary at an early stage to make sure that that insurance is available to the extent required and that it's available at a economic price. We could move to the next slide. Looking at the project revenues, a large-scale hydrogen project could well have several different revenue streams. There could be electricity generation, which is sold into surplus electricity being sold into the grid. There could be long-term ammonia export contracts. There could be some domestic customers, industrial customers to whom hydrogen is sold, and there could be carbon credits and other forms of revenue coming from policy support. So each of these different revenue streams will have their own revenue profiles and their own unique risks. And these will need to be explained to insurers, to investors, and to lenders with a good story as to how any shortfall in these revenue streams is mitigated. Long-term offtake contracts will be key as a mainstay of the revenue for the project, because there is currently no spot market for hydrogen. And so lenders will need to have certainty that there will be a customer that will pay at a economic price over a long-term basis in order to underpin the project debt. It is likely, looking at the experience in the LNG sector, that the price of hydrogen in any long-term offtake contract could be linked to the market prices of other fuels, in particular oil. So if that's the case, there's obviously a large degree of volatility there. And so that may push lenders towards requiring additional liquidity reserve accounts and cash sweep mechanisms to try and reduce the risk that is created by that volatility in price. And the counterparty credit risk is going to be very important for lenders to look at, because that is what underwrites the revenue. And on the plus side for that, the typical customer for hydrogen is likely to be a relatively creditworthy entity, electricity utilities, large-scale industrial consumers, and so forth. So those are likely to be the sorts of counterparties that banks would like to see. And the particular risk will arise around any carbon credits or similar kinds of revenues that derive from policy support, because that depends on the political will being available and the government having the necessary finances. And we've seen renewable projects in the past have fallen into difficulties when governments can no longer support that revenue stream. So, for example, after the financial crash, many solar projects in Southern Europe ran into problems when subsidies were withdrawn. We could move to the next slide. So as we said, looking at the topic of government support, there are a number of different options which governments are looking at, including carbon pricing, carbon taxes, and so forth. And the position in Japan and Europe is particularly key, as they are the likely export markets. So I'd like Adam to just jump in here and speak a little bit about what's happening in Europe and the UK in terms of policy support for importing hydrogen, and what the prospects are there, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure, thanks. So one of the things which people might be aware of is the EU's proposal for a carbon border adjustment mechanism, so-called. And what this comes from is that the fact that you've had EU carbon pricing, which has affected a lot of heavy industries for a while, although its effect has been sort of mitigated or disguised by the fact that in the EU emission trading system they get free allowances, but the idea is that must stop, and that is partly to encourage them to do things like, you know, invest in technologies which use this kind of low carbon hydrogen we've been talking about, rather than fossil fuels to make steel or whatever it is. But in doing that, obviously that means that they become more exposed to a so-called carbon leakage, to competition from places where there are not such rigorous carbon pricing regimes, and therefore you end up with the capacity being closed down and production getting moved to other regions. So the idea of a carbon border adjustment is to say, well, when certain goods get imported into the EU, they will be charged effectively almost like a duty, which is equivalent to the EU carbon price. And there's a proposal as part of the package that I mentioned earlier, that was published in July, of proposed legislation that would bring various sectors like steel, like, crucially for our purposes, fertilizers, so ammonia, into that regime. What does that mean? It means that if you are producing, if you're, for example, producing green ammonia, then that is something which would be not subject to the carbon border adjustment mechanism, because you'll take account of the fact that it didn't have the emissions as normally associated with production of ammonia using grey hydrogen or whatever, and therefore it would have an advantage in being imported into the EU. It's not clear whether the UK is going to follow the EU down this carbon border adjustment mechanism route, but it has a lot of its own efforts to decarbonise heavy industry in the UK, which would also benefit from this sort of playing field levelling type of measure. I mean, there's an element of sort of global macro climate diplomacy here as to quite at what speed these mechanisms evolve, but it's certainly something which could be very beneficial to the kind of low carbon hydrogen sector.
Thanks, Adam. If we could move to the next slide, please. So we just like to finish up by looking at what's likely to happen in the future. So given the current state of the economics and technology and so forth, it seems to us that the first wave of major projects we're likely to see will be based around blue hydrogen. And in fact, we're already starting to see those with a recent project completed last year with Aramco shipping blue hydrogen to Japan. So that's an easy place to start as a natural fit for national oil companies who can enhance the project economics with oil recovery and have the existing oil fields to store the carbon. But then towards the end of this decade, towards the 2030s, we see the costs of green hydrogen falling sufficiently so as to become competitive on a standalone basis. We also see nuclear power potentially being used as a source to produce pink hydrogen, with a substantial amount of nuclear capacity coming on stream in the UAE and also being planned in Saudi Arabia. So that could facilitate green hydrogen through, or rather pink hydrogen through that process. As the policy discussion around carbon pricing, carbon taxes progress, that should be a major push towards generating sufficient demand for GCC hydrogen. And then finally, the other big trend which we think works towards hydrogen's favour is this push towards ESG green financing. And we're seeing that take off around the world and also in this region, with a number of countries issuing green bonds and funds being set up to invest specifically in the renewable sector and looking to hydrogen, as including the Dubai Green Fund and the National Renewable Energy Programme in Saudi Arabia. So we think these trends are going to play out over the coming years. Thank you.